Welcome back to Intercultural Conflict Resolution. Last week I introduced culture as a frame, a socialized, internalized frame. I hope that was helpful to some of you. This week I would like to introduce culture, and for those of you who may go on to get a PhD in anthropology, there are many ways of introducing culture. I'm just using a couple to get us started in this course. But this week, I would like to introduce culture as social norms, expectations about life, about negotiation, about communication, problem solving. I have a model of escalating destructive conflict, a model that I use in teaching when I teach theories of conflict, withholding these truths. This model is presented in case study 4, a model that helps all of you learn what I have found works, is effective with angry parties, with angry people, angry employees, and even is used by law enforcement within the criminal justice industry with violent, potentially violent, historically violent people. I'm going to be turning to that model today briefly so that you understand how I see culture and expectations. Let me turn to that PowerPoint now. This is a model, as I said, of escalating conflict. If you take a look at the lower end of the beginning, in my mind, of the model, you will see social learning cultural spillover theory. The reason I have it there is that line that you see actually describes a baseline, our day-to-day normal behavior, free of conflict. But full of human beings living their life, and of course full of various cultures and religions, and as I introduced last week, full of our social learning. Now, cultural spillover theory, if you've read about it in Holding These Truths, you might remember this, says that how we live in our day-to-day life and how our children and youth live represents what we have taught ourselves, each other, and them about culture. So if we have grown up in a violent culture like most Americans have, you don't need to live in gang territory in LA. Most of us live in violent communities, whether that violence is happening privately in the home, with children who are being abused, spouses are being abused, within the church, once again, when children and others are being abused, or visibly in the community. We have grown up in an extremely violent community. So violence is actually part of the social norms and the expectations of many Americans. Now, right above this, you will see root expectations. Albert Ellis was the psychologist who created the theory of root expectations, and these are the expectations that are buried in us normally. They have been a part of us since we were very, very young children, and they contain our cultural expectations, but most of us would struggle with identifying them because they are very much a part of our automatic processing system. We discover them when we are interacting with someone from a different culture, from a different social learning, because they are going to violate our root expectations with all sorts of things that they do. And until you've had a chance to intimately know people from other cultures, and we have several different cultures in the United States, so hopefully all of you have had an experience of cultural difference where you feel like you have been offended, irritated, at the very least you don't understand why the other person is doing what they're doing, You're discovering your root expectations. Let me give you some concrete examples. Now, once again, if you were in my ethics class or my theories of conflict class and studied holding these truths, you've had an opportunity to see some of the actual cultural expectations of my students of the last 20 years from 80 plus countries in describing gender relationships, decision-making processes, problem solving, and communication variables. My students over the years have created over 100 different statements to describe their NCRP cultural expectations. Once again, if you haven't had a chance to see these, you might want to look at a copy of Holding These Truths. Let me, as I promised, give you a couple of concrete examples. And this is enough with my PowerPoint right now. If you're curious how to diffuse and de-escalate angry, violent conflict, I guess you're going to have to get Holding These Truths or enroll in my ethics or my theories course. What I would like to say today is that interruption is a wonderful example of a cultural variable. Californians, at least those that I've known, believe not interrupting is sacred. That a person cannot be polite, cannot be a good human being unless they do not interrupt. And they are shocked to discover there are cultures around the world where if you do not interrupt, you offend. I had a Jamaican student many years ago who said, if my Jamaican friends do not interrupt me, I assume they're not listening, they're not interested in what I'm saying. That's one example of just one small but very common cultural variable that differs enormously culture to culture. Now, when I introduce Hofstede's artificial synthetic cultures, I will also be talking about high and low context cultures. We are considered, and when I say we, I'm an American, I'm speaking to the Americans in the class. Americans are considered a low context culture where we tell everybody what we want, what we expect, what we think. It's all open. So Americans are shocked, surprised, ill-prepared when they travel the world and discover, for example, in many Asian cultures, there is a high context communication, meaning that many of the members of the culture already understand what's expected. Who has the most authority in the room, for example, who will speak, who will not speak. So that's not going to be laid out on the table. Americans will need to get to know that culture to figure out what the rules of social interaction are. Japan is probably the most homogeneous of these cultures, though. Korean culture is is very homogeneous as well. Now, Indian culture cannot be classified with high context communication. China's a very high context communication as well. You cannot simply say all Asian cultures do this, all Western cultures do this, all African cultures do this, all Latino cultures do this. You can't do it. It's just not the complexity of our world. Another variable I'll share with you today to give you a concrete sense of how complicated this is eye contact. Eye contact, even in the United States, is a variable that differs culture to culture. When I first came to Dominguez Hills, which came out of the LA riots, was to serve the local community that had been rioting during that time. If I was to look someone in the eye and greet them directly, I often got suspicious looks. My students would say, that's not the community neighborhood I grew up in. Who is this woman? I have also worked with indigenous communities in this country where American Indian children have been expelled from public schools because they would not look adults in the eye. And those adults were ignorant about the cultural fact that by not looking them in the eye, they were being highly respectful of their elders. So eye contact varies, just like interruption, and I'm just starting, as you can imagine, to pull apart all the different variables that differ culturally around the world. Gender is a huge discussion that I don't know if I'll even be able to start in this course. Tone of voice, it's very, very layered and complex. But I think you understand that expectations are a way we experience our own culture and others' culture. Now, how do we learn these different expectations so we don't start conflict, offend someone? Well, I would once again say NCRP gives us many tools. First of all, if people do not experience you as an open-minded person, you need to work on that. You need to become more open to cultural difference within your own country, around the world. I have explored this variable on the streets. I think I've done it more in Long Beach and Southern California than I have elsewhere, but I've done it in a few different parts of the world. And I'll tell you, you have a problem with accents if your mind is closed and judgmental. I have watched Americans in particular. I can't generalize. This is a very diverse class. Some of you come and were raised from other countries than the United States. Please listen to this, as something I'm saying about Americans. But the Americans I see on the street who hear someone from another country speak impeccable English, but don't understand what they are saying, have a problem, in my experience, with judgment, mental judgment, with a quick dismissal of the other person because they sound differently. Now, I actually have an accent for those who are from the West Coast. And, if some of you are from or have spent time in New York, New Yorkers have strong accents, strong personalities. We have a lot of difference in this country. I was born in the South, so I'm, quite aware of Southern culture. A problem with accent in a country that has so many needs to be corrected by trying to quiet that quick mental dismissal and judgment, and just, quiet your mind and get to know the other person. And interest in knowing the other person is going to help you assess their expectations. NCRP says we can negotiate ground rules and expectations together. Everybody gets to have a say, a share in negotiating ground rules. So that helps with your assessment. As I mentioned earlier, learning to observe will serve you. I think I've said enough for one lecture. I look forward to joining you again next week. Have a great week.